Yeah, we are live.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our evening keynote session. We are incredibly honored and pleased to have Professor Lisa Rasmussen with us this evening. She is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, and she's also a faculty fellow in the graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her research focuses, as you can tell from the title of her talk, on ethical issues in research, and she's really particularly interested in thinking about ethics in unregulated research areas like citizen science, which is why we've invited her here today, and other things like DIY bio. She teaches bioethics and also research ethics, and she's an editor-in-chief of Accountability in Research, a co-editor of the Philosophy and Medicine book series that has been published by Springer, an associate editor of Citizen Science Theory and Practice, and author of numerous articles and public and academic pieces surrounding ethics and issues in involving citizens in research and academia. We are super honored to have her here, and I hope you'll ask her lots of questions. So please remember to put your questions in the Slack channel where you're viewing this, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. And without further ado, Lisa, please take it away, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Shannon. I am so honored to be here, and I only wish it could be in person, and hopefully someday that will happen again. So thank you all so much for tuning in, especially at the end of what I know is a long day. On my side, it's the beginning of the day. So this is a great way for me to get started. So I'm going to talk about ethical issues in citizen science, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of what some colleagues and I have started to call establishment research or traditional research. It's hard to know what to call that usual kind of research that doesn't end up denigrating citizen science. So establishment seems like it does a good job. And I think there's a lot, a lot you can say about citizen science just on its own. But when we think about research ethics and the way it's been treated for decades in the United States and India and other countries around the world, it's important to think about how it grew up within an establishment science framework, so that we can better understand why we need to step out of that. So I'm going to start by finding my button here. I'm going to acknowledge first some funding that we received for working on a grant called Establishing Norms of Data Ethics in Citizen Science from the National Science Foundation here in the United States. And Karen Cooper's name may be familiar to some of you. I think she gave a keynote last year at this conference. And so she's the PI, I'm a co-PI, and then we have a wonderful postdoctoral researcher, Elizabeth Jones. So I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about that research because I think it will help citizen science in the United States and also around the world. So when we think about the context of traditional or establishment science, there are a couple of hallmarks that we need to think about. It's institutional, it's conventionally funded, it's traditionally disseminated, journal publications, et cetera. And so citizen science looks very different. I don't need to tell you all this, but it's just to rehearse, get it in our memory here. Citizen science is often non-institutional, but it can be institutional. It can be unconventionally funded. Either people are paying to do it themselves, and it may be minimal cost. It could be crowdfunded. They might have grants from private institutions. And it's often non-traditionally disseminated, either in blogs, press releases, policy briefs, report backs to community who were involved, reviews after the publications come out, or even it may be chosen not to be disseminated, which would be unusual for traditional science. So when we keep that framework in mind, then it's easier to understand that establishment research ethics follows establishment science or establishment research. And this is a wonderful quote that I think summarizes it well. Research ethics in the United States and in other countries often, quote, operates through a logic of institutional research managed through a set of institutional practices. And so I can give you a whole history of how this happened in the United States, but it was mainly after the Second World War that funding was driven to research institutions. And so when that was the main mode of funding for research, all you needed to do is add some regulations to the top of that funding, and then you can protect human subjects You can provide some guidelines for research misconduct allegations and things like that. So these establishment science and establishment research ethics kind of travel together. But as you all know, citizen science is often extra institutional. It takes place outside of institutions. There might be partnerships with researchers from institutions, but citizen science might, or scientists might or might not be conventionally trained in research or be subject to ethics regulations within their institution or have received research ethics training. So I hasten to add, none of this is to say or suggest in any way that citizen scientists aren't ethical. I think there's reason to believe that maybe there's a lot more ethical research being done in citizen science. But it's to say that when we rely on conventional training paths, conventional regulatory paths, we're going to miss a whole bunch of research that's happening outside those areas. But in a way, even more importantly, I think some of the ethical values in citizen science can be really different from those in traditional science. So just to take a very simple example, what counts as a human subject in citizen science? Does that framework even make sense? Right? Because a human subject is subject to having research done on them. And in the United States, we have a long and terrible history about abusing human subjects of research. Human participation in citizen science looks very different from that. So we need to think about some of these basic frameworks. And I think establishment research ethics may not be a good fit for citizen science. So here's just a kind of a complicated, wordy slide. I apologize, but it's an example I had to put together in my own mind for thinking about where the overlaps are and where the lack of fit is. So you can see that the top circle is citizen science research, and then the bottom is left is regulatory principles, like the ethical principles of regulations. And the bottom right is the coverage of regulations. And there's this area A in the middle where you have citizen science, the principles are proper for that science, that research, and the coverage, the regulations cover it, right? But that's a very small piece, actually. So what I'm more interested in talking about really is the bottom left circle of regulatory ethical principles that don't exactly fit citizen science. So I think the conclusion we have to draw is that we need citizen science research ethics. We can't just take the conventional research ethics and kind of plop it on top of citizen science for many different reasons, which you can probably guess at. So I want to talk about first some of the ethical issues that we're going to talk about or that we face in citizen science, and then what we can do about those. And I'm going to go relatively quickly through these because I want to talk a little bit more about some of the solutions. And I should also hasten to say that this is not an exhaustive list. It's, again, trying to gather things together in conceptual buckets for myself as much as anything else. So the first issue is data ethics. And there's a long list of topics we could talk about in data ethics, but I'm going to focus here on quality and privacy. So I think when you probably have faced this when you're participating in citizen science, people can be a little skeptical about the rigor of citizen science. And there are many articles that have come out in recent years saying there's reason to believe that citizen science is just as rigorous, and especially in areas where it's what's called fit for purpose. The rigor is appropriate to the project being done. It's very good. But, there's skepticism out there. And so I think this is an ethical issue because if you do bad science, then it's unethical. Ethics demands quality research. Otherwise, it's just a waste of resources and time. As science, it may not be a waste for other reasons. But if it's not good science, then it's unethical. So it also may be the case that a lack of formal training poses challenges to quality, data management, things like that. These are very hard skills. I don't have them. And so when you need to make sure your data is managed in a particular way, it's protected. You protect it from error, which is really important for disseminating good research results. Then you need training on that. And there are ways to get it, but it needs to be addressed. Another issue in data ethics is privacy. And there are all kinds of ramifications of privacy. But the basic point is, how do you make sure you protect the data that is sensitive in some way? And there can be many different ways in which it's sensitive. but also maybe achieve your goals of either participating in open science or making sure that contributors of the data have the access that they expect, right? So you may have a bunch of contributors adding data to a data set with a GPS location of their home, for example. That's not necessarily something you want just anybody in the world to have access to, but you might want your participants and your citizen scientists to have access to that. And so you need to navigate those things, and that can be very complicated. Another issue is just the money issue, compensation, credit, resources, et cetera. So again, let's just look at the contrast between establishment researchers and citizen scientists. So we all know establishment researchers may have employment by virtue of being establishment. They have employment, they may be funded through grants or through their institutions, and they have clear incentives to progress, to contribute to the scientific community, to the world, to achieve publications, et cetera. And they may own the data and have intellectual property in the data. On the other hand, citizen scientists are often, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, as we say in the States, may be unpaid or maybe volunteers, and they may be unfunded or self-funded, and they may or may not have ownership over the data that they produce. And I'll talk about an alternative model of ownership a little bit later. Another issue when it comes to the money is who gets credit for the work. So citizen scientists may not receive credit in publications or in other ways for their contributions. There's a wide variety of possibilities, including recognizing that some citizen scientists may want and or need to remain anonymous based on the kind of work that they're doing. If naming themselves would expose them to dangers or risks, then maybe we don't want to look at authorship in the same way that we do in establishment science, which requires, if you've had a substantial contribution to a project, that you be named so that people understand who did the work. That may be different in citizen science. And there are also significant barriers to funding for citizen scientists. So just in the United States, for example, in order to get a grant from the federal government, there needs to be a very elaborate system of checks and balances and accounting to make sure the money is being used in the way that it said it was going to be used. And that is an obligation our federal government has to taxpayers. I imagine there are similar barriers in India, where if you're a certain kind of entity, you just cannot receive these kinds of grants. And then moreover, within a grant, there are different kinds of barriers based on how you can use the money. So just to give you a quick example, in our project, we wanted to think about paying human participants differently in acknowledgement of inequitable status. And so we learned, looking through the literature, that it's almost a mantra in research ethics that everybody should be paid the same for the same work, right? An equality mindset. And we have approached it with an equity mindset for how we're paying our participants. So I can say more about that later, but it also depends on your review board within your institution about whether they let you do that. So there are lots of barriers to funding citizen science. Another significant issue is collaboration and power dynamics. And the assumption in traditional science is the university researchers come in and they just are used to being the ones who run the show. And they need to have that mindset because they're taking responsibility for the work that they're doing. But on the other hand, when they enter into a citizen science project, the citizen scientists may actually be the leaders of the project, or they may see it as an equal partnership. And when the traditional scientists or establishment scientists don't see it that way, there's real potential for significant tensions. Collaboration may also require clarifying who counts as the community and who speaks for the community when you're working with a particular group of people. I think it's different when you have a project that is grown from the bottom up. A community gets together, they pick the people who speak for them and lead them, then it's organic. But when there's a partnership, the researcher wants to figure out, how would I tell the difference between someone who says they speak for the community and they really don't, versus someone who actually does speak for the community? And what if I think that person is doing something wrong? How do I interact with that person who says they're speaking for the community. So there are some issues of power dynamics and collaboration that we need to think about in citizen science. Another area that I've become far more sensitized to in this work is thinking about basically dissemination of results. But in academia, we present it, we publish it, maybe we have IP, intellectual property, or we get other dividends, and then that's the end of the story. That's just the way that we disseminate our results. And there's never been another expectation in establishment science, although there have been debates and questions about advocacy based on results. However, ironically, because of the way that we have organized our entire publishing industry, these publications might be inaccessible to the very people who made it possible. In addition, the community might expect report backs, which are different, I think, than what we started to call on our grant report outs, meaning the traditional path. Report backs take the data, put it into a context for the people who have made the research possible, and then give it back to them in a way that they want it formatted. That can look very different from a traditional publication. It might not include, for example, an entire method section, or it might sketch out a method section. But what participants might want is, here's how many bird sightings you had or how many water samples you took in the context of the whole grant, and how many you did. So either it tells you your effort compared with other people in the project, or it tells you what your samples found vis-a-vis the whole rest of the project. And that looks very different from a regular publication. And even more significantly, and I think this is a really interesting conversation to have within establishment science as well, is community may expect action on or solution of a problem as a result of research. So what we found in conversations with the environmental justice community here in the United States is they are very tired of exploitative research that comes in, makes use of the community to gather data, and then leaves and publishes it, and then nothing is ever done. And the community has expended effort and ends up with the situation not being any better than it was to begin with. So communities are increasingly saying what we expect as a result of this research partnership is solution to a problem. And that is potentially in tension with the purported objectivity of science. So that's something we can, focus on. And the result is an ethical tension between expectations. Accountability is something else I just wanted to mention briefly. Again, this is not to suggest that citizen scientists would commit research misconduct at any different levels than establishment researchers, but the difference is if somebody were to do that, there are no oversight mechanisms when you're not within an institution. So if you're in, I've been on a few of these committees myself, research misconduct committees, someone's accused of committing research misconduct, fabrication of data, plagiarism or something. There's a whole process that gets going within the institution to investigate it. And then there are solutions and ways you report to journals and funding agencies. The whole thing is packaged for you. That isn't the case in citizen science. And I think if we set aside the well-meaning citizen scientists from what I think we may be more likely to see going forward, which is people who are taking advantage of the framework of citizen science to seed the data, seed the science for PR, for sowing confusion, for intentionally putting fabricated evidence into the science community. I think those are the things we need to guard against, not so much. I'm not so worried about actual citizen scientists, but some of these other things. However, I will also say briefly, I think that in order to have society trust citizen science, we need to be able to show them that there's a mechanism for getting bad stuff taken care of in some fashion. Otherwise, it would be normal for all of us to say, well, who knows if we can trust that data or not. And I'll talk about that. That's the bulk of what I'm going to talk about next is trust. But I think also when we talk about accountability, we need to talk about accountability to citizen scientists, that researchers may traditionally think of the obligations of the contributors and their data to the research, to the researchers, but it needs to go the other way as well. And researchers need to think about, when I partner with a community, what do I owe them? Okay, so if we want to build ethics capacity in citizen science, we have a lot to think about. Citizen science is global, it's interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary, it's diverse. And I don't mean the traditional kinds of ways we think about diversity, although that matters too, but it's also diverse amounts of training, diverse sources of funding, diverse expectations and motivations. The people who do citizen science for Zooniverse or Galaxy Zoo and look at pictures of galaxies are very different from the people who are sampling water in their neighborhood to take care of a pollution problem. So somehow when we think about ethics and citizen science, all of that needs to be able to be addressed. And I think it's a big job. So I think we need a few things in order to deal with this. We need mechanisms for trust. And I don't think national laws can cover it all. We don't have national laws in the United States that say what research misconduct is or human subject research abuse is, for example. We have regulations that are attached to money. And that is actually very different when you're thinking about these kinds of research that are not being funded by federal sources or central sources. There are countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, I think those have a national law. So if you were doing citizen science in one of those countries, you might be subject to those laws in a way that you're not in the United States. And I apologize, I just don't know enough about the framework of research ethics in India to know whether it's closer to one or the other system. Another option might be tort or civil law, so suing somebody for damages over research, but that's going to be really slow, really expensive, and arbitrary because it just depends on which cases end up going forward to court because of who has money to pursue it. And it will take too long to build a body of case law that would help us understand what the frameworks are. I think disciplinary rules, like if you have a biology data management suggestions, or if you have sociology frameworks for interacting with human subjects, those help, but they're limited, especially because, sort of look again at the top of the slide, a lot of citizen science is really multidisciplinary. So which of those do you pick to use as a framework? And all of this together, I think, would still not be enough. It would just be this very patchy, open net that would get some things, but it would let a lot go through. So I think the way that I've been thinking about this in recent years is thinking about a trust architecture. And the places where people have talked about trust architecture more recently are things like cryptocurrency and online platforms in terms of how the money changes hands, like Airbnb, Uber, maybe Amazon. An early one was PayPal through eBay. So in these cases, the real advance was figuring out a way to build a system that people would trust, because you're not going to buy things on eBay if you can't trust PayPal, for example. You're not going to order a rideshare car if you don't think that your data is going to be protected when you get in that car. There are other reasons to worry about those kinds of things, but it's about the money in these cases. And so I think the trust architecture that we need to think about is, what can we build that will help us help us trust citizen science? So first, I just want to talk briefly about what is a trust architecture. And this is the way some colleagues and I defined it recently. It's a set of structures, formal, informal, or a combination, that build legitimacy and trust for an enterprise while also protecting from a particular kind of harm. So usually you trust things, you need to trust them because there's a risk to you. You don't try and trust things because of the benefits to you. So here's a couple of examples. We regulate all kinds of industries. We have planes that have to be inspected, buses, cars that need to be transported, that need to be regulated so that they're kept up to appropriate standards. Food that needs to be kept refrigerated and things like that. There's a set of guidelines, and we can't evaluate whether, most of us can't evaluate whether a plane is safe to get on. We trust the whole system of regulation for the industry, we might not trust it 100%, but we mostly trust it. We trust it enough to eat the food and get on the plane or the bus. Similarly, bank deposit insurance makes it more comfortable for us to put our money in a bank rather than in a can under the bed because there's an insurance policy if somehow the money is lost. Same thing with encryption. And this is a different kind of example, but the trust architecture we have for conflicts of interest, I think, is this idea that you declare your potential conflicts of interest, and then someone else might help you manage them, right? And again, we may not trust this 100%, but we've invented this whole system to help us figure out how to make it less risky for us. So here are a couple of key questions, I think, for a citizen science trust architecture. What purpose does the trust architecture serve? So is it, for example, and there can be many different answers to this question, is it to show that the data is trustworthy, in which case your trust architecture might focus on requiring everybody who's contributing data to have a certain kind of training, to managing it in a certain kind of software system or encrypted or protected on a computer, et cetera? Or another kind of example, does the trust architecture serve to guarantee or reassure society that we didn't abuse people in the context of this research, right? You see how those are very different, and they're compatible. You might want both of them, and often you will, but you need to think about what your goals are in order to build the right trust architecture. What kinds of harms are you worried about protecting people from? So are there privacy harms from people's data being released? That's going to require one kind of solution in architecture, but there are also maybe reputational harms of either the whole field of citizen science or particular researchers or particular community, et cetera. And then you need to think about who needs to trust whom. We're maybe used to that being more unidirectional, and maybe we need to think about it more as a reciprocal relationship. So does the public need to trust the results of the research? Do the participants need to trust the researchers? Do the researchers need to trust the participants? So these are all questions you need to think about when building a trust architecture. So I wanted to give you two quick examples of what I think you could think of as a trust architecture. So I've given you a QR code here because you can read more about this project. This QR code takes you to the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in the United States that focuses on the West End Revitalization Association. And they're located in Mebane, North Carolina, which is just up the road from me, a couple of hours. And it's this phenomenal community that 25 or more years ago organized themselves into the West End Revitalization Association. And they decided they were going to argue for the rights to which they were entitled. For example, being attached to the city water line, the city sewer line. And this is predominantly African-American community. And so if you know anything about the United States, you know about our terrible history between white and Black citizens and residents. And so they were not getting the things that other residents were. And they've produced many papers and they've achieved a lot of wonderful things. But for these purposes, what I want to draw your attention to is a framework that they came up with called community-owned and managed research. And their principles are funding equity, management parity, and science for compliance. And that sums up a lot of the things I was talking about earlier. So funding equity should be that it's not just that the money all goes to a research institution and they dole out a few little bits to the community, but rather there's a real equity with the funding based on who's doing the work. Management parity is that power dynamics and collaboration that I was talking about, that you need to respect each other as equal partners within the framework of the research. And then finally, science for compliance is a significant focus of theirs, which is to say the reason we're doing the research is to bring our local community into compliance with what's expected in their particular case. So a third principle somewhere else might look a little bit different than that. Might be science for action, right? Solving a problem. So I think this is an example of a trust architecture this community has built and we can look back at the principles or the questions I asked here, right? What purpose does the trust architecture serve? Well, in this case, it's to protect the community from potentially being exploited by the researchers and to achieve the goal that they intend to be achieving with their efforts. From what harm should they be protected? Well, in the case of Comer, it's protecting the community from being exploited by the researchers and having their labor wasted. And who needs to trust whom? In this case, again, it's the community saying, we need to trust you. And in order for us to trust you, here are the things that you need to follow. So I think for a long time, communities have been in a lower power situation than researchers, because the researchers are the ones with the funding and the training and the knowledge in many cases. And the community then is supposed to just do whatever the researchers say. And this is a really excellent example of a community saying, great, we want to partner with you too, but we're going to have these terms, not your terms. Okay, so another kind of trust architecture I wanted to talk about is the work that we're doing in this grant, which is called Establishing Norms of Data Ethics in Citizen Science. And let me, so it's a partnership between, sponsored by NSF, NC State, which is where Karen Cooper is, UNC Charlotte, which is where I am, and the Citizen Science Association in the United States. And we're calling it Building Trustworthy Data Practices. So the genesis of the grant was the acknowledgement that citizen science might need tools to help it do the right thing, not because of a lack of will, but because there are so many details to keep straight. And just to give a quick example, let's say you want to make your data open, right? There are many different choices you could have. You can make them fully open, partly open, fully closed. And then you need to talk about who has access, even if it's closed to the external world, who has access on the inside to that kind of data. There are issues about report backs that I was talking about and how to credit citizen science participants. So what we decided to do with this grant was start with a survey of, I think we have about 400 citizen science projects that are listed on citsci.org and SciStarter. And we are scraping the publicly available data about what they're saying they're doing with people's data, what people can expect at the conclusion of the project, et cetera. Now, I'll hasten to say, just because it's not posted on the web doesn't mean they're not actually doing it. So I think the results will show a little less protection of privacy or something just because they didn't say anything about it. So that was our starting place. What are people actually doing? And then the second phase is thinking about what should we be doing? And for that, we engaged in some surveys of people who opted into the project. And then we have conducted a number of focus groups and workshops to sort of think about what are the areas we need to focus on? What kinds of tools do we build? So right now we are fortunately nearing the end, and we are actually building our tools as a result of some phenomenal contributions that people have made in our focus groups and workshops. So just to kind of give you an example, the beginning of the toolkit will have a glossary that helps define tools for citizen science, a sort of research integrity guideline to talk to both project leaders and citizen scientists about the importance of research integrity and what they're doing. And then we go on to have a few other tools about how to credit participants for the work and the different, we have a decision guide sort of to guide project leaders through thinking about that, how to make data open when you want to do that. And then we've got some case studies to help people think about ethical issues in citizen science and talk about them with each other. So at the conclusion of this project, we're going to post this toolkit and it'll be available for all of you. We're going to have a course, basically a sort of online course introducing these tools. Then we'll have just the static tools and PDFs and things. And then within the Citizen Science Association framework, we'll have maybe discussions about certain tools or try and fill in some more information. So the idea here is that a leadership group within citizen science might put together tools that are freely available. I think it's really important for citizen science to help people do the right thing when they're motivated to do it, right? We can't motivate someone who doesn't care about ethics, but it's very possible to be motivated to do the right thing and not quite know how. So that's what we'll do with these tools, is make some area just data practices, right? There's a lot of other things going on in citizen science we could pay attention to ethically. But we're trying to help at least in this one little area. And it's been a huge job just with this little area. So I just wanted to introduce one more possibility for a trust architecture, which is that maybe the people involved in a project could build the trust architecture with each other. It's sort of like erecting a local little house as opposed to some massive institutional edifice. Right. So project managers or platforms like citsci.org that host projects would be responsible for establishing a research plan that's acceptable to participants and users. So we might get together, if we're a group of researchers together, and say, okay, well, what kind of data are we going to collect? Are we going to collect personally identifiable information? What are we going to do with that? How are we going to protect it? Who's going to find out about the answers? Who's going to make decisions about the project? And so when we talk about this all together, it'll make it hopefully easier for us to trust each other and build that trust architecture. And one other related tool that we're working on is something we're calling a reciprocity document, which is a kind of combination between an informed consent form and a memorandum of understanding. And the idea is, when researchers and citizen scientists and participants and partners get together, they would look at this document and think about what they want to tell each other about their expectations, right? So that would give the researcher an opportunity to hear from the citizen scientist, hey, we want to know X and Y and Z by the end of the project. And the researcher might say, I would like to make sure you all go through this particular training for this kind of data collection, right? So that literally you're getting all on the same page. That's the kind of goal. And so it's a mini trust architecture within a project. I think free or inexpensive tools like that reciprocity document will be needed to help them do that. And this is where societies can play a significant role. And there are resources out there right now. How do you manage data? What are some good platforms for doing that, et cetera? But I think it'll be really important to have system structures, procedures in place when you're having a negotiation, if you're really having a negotiation that tries to equalize power. For example, you don't necessarily invite a community member to the institution where they have to fight traffic to get on campus and then pay $20 to park there, find their way through a building, and then sit there with a bunch of people in white lab coats or whatever it happens to be. You might try and find neutral territory, and you might specify that we're equal partners, right? So there are ways that we'll need to make this negotiation not foreordained just because somebody has more power to begin with. So right before I end here, I just do want to, I'm actually fairly optimistic, but there are a lot of big challenges to thinking about a trust architecture in citizen science. Practically speaking, there's not one lever. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on. And so we may never have a centralized understanding of research ethics and citizen science in the way that we do in establishment science. I think there are conceptual challenges. What do you even call a human subject in need of protection? Right now, it's regulatorily defined, but how do we define it in citizen science? There are other conceptual challenges, like what is research? When are we doing research versus monitoring? Does one need a certain kind of protection, not the other? Financial challenges we've gone through already. There's a lot. This takes money. Building the trust architecture, following it through, even just simple things like having the right software to manage your data takes money, and that is not in the offing for a lot of citizen science research. There are constitutional or legal challenges, which I guess I don't want to linger on, except just to say that we can't prevent people from deciding they want to get together and ask a certain question and work on it together, right? They just have the freedom to do that. And so when you think about regulating or covering research with a law, what exactly is it that you're covering that covers the right thing but doesn't tread on people's freedom of speech or assembly? And then there are ideological challenges. So there's sort of this huge community ethos in citizen science, but there's also a kind of hacker ethos, like we're just going to move fast and break things, to quote the old Google line. And we don't want to be regulated. We don't want to care about any of these things. So these are just some of the huge issues in citizen science as we think about research ethics. I just want to say really quickly, some of these ideas I first worked out in a paper that was published online earlier this year, and there's a DOI there, you can find it. And these are just a couple of quick references from the talk. Thank you all so much, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Whew. That was amazing. I have my brain exploded a little bit from that talk. That was really, really great. And we have a lot of questions for you. So I also hope your brain doesn't explode, because there's a lot of good questions that came in. So if you don't mind, Lisa, I'd like to jump right to them, because they actually deal with a lot of really interesting topics as well. So Paul has asked, in respect to ownership, what do you think of citizen science projects or websites that require a request for data for accessing the data? Would it be a better model to have open access to such data rather than having to request it, barring something like a threatened species or some other protected information? You mentioned the locations of people's homes, for example. If everyone is agreeing that their submitted data can be used by anyone for research or visualization, etc.
There's no one answer to that question, I think, is the first thing I'll say. The second most important thing I will say is that everybody needs to be on the same page about that, right? So that if it is, as you say, everyone has already agreed that all of their data can be shared, then yes, I think to make it's both a contribution to science and a celebration of the work that's been done that you make it publicly available. However, it's important, I think, to think ahead of time about, what's the worst use this data could be put to? Because sometimes you think that the data is just fine, and then triangulation of data is another significant issue, right? So that your data set is actually fine. If it's the only thing that existed in the world, then it wouldn't be a problem. But then when you combine it with this other data set over here, then all of a sudden people can be re-identified. And this has been an issue. There was a Netflix challenge where they challenged people to write a better algorithm for suggesting movies people might like. And to do that, they released a data set, which was then combined with another data set, International Movie Database, I think it's called IMDb. And then you could re-identify some of the people in this anonymous data set, right? So there are sort of famous examples of that kind of thing going on. I'll end there.
So I think these are going to be complicated questions. I don't think there will be one answer, but I think these are just, like I said, we're a burgeoning community, so we're just now really thinking about them, or really having a community to express things that a lot of us have been thinking about for many years. Ram has a question, says, thank you for a great presentation. And the question is about the different citizen science models, where some of the establishment research agencies are incorporating citizen science as a tool with people just being seen as actually data point suppliers rather than having any voice that they are providing. And these actually can be institutionalized actually as well. Just wondering about your thoughts on that. So
so the sort of spectrum of citizen science is crowdfunded, or contributory, all the way to sort of ground up or community. So I think if you're in a really contributory crowdfunded kind of model, you're just, let's say you're doing one of the games, Fold It or Eyes on Alzheimer's, Eyes on Alz, where you're just going online, you're spending a few days or minutes, not days, procrastinating, and you're playing this game and you're contributing to citizen science, and you might not care what, fine. So you've taken 15 minutes, but I got something out of it too. I got to play a game. And, we can't underestimate that it is important for people to contribute, especially in that Alzheimer's, just to bring up that example. There are people in nursing homes who are doing this project, which is trying to identify where some of the blocks in the brain blood vessels might be, right? And it really matters to them because they feel the risk of it more than other people. So that's important. But the other danger is this exploitation. And I think there was Karen Cooper and I co-edited a journal issue for Citizen Science Theory and Practice, and it's all freely available if you want to go to the Citizen Science Theory and Practice website. It's a block right on the top that says Special Collection on Ethics. And there was a paper in there, and I just can't remember the author's name, I apologize, but it was about neoliberalism and the abuse of citizen science. And as it was enshrined in the European Union, I can't remember which legal act it was, but the idea was, hey, we should take advantage of citizen scientists because that will save us money. I mean, it was just that simple in the regulations. And so, for people who really want to go and beautify the park near them, that's great. They're giving back, but it's as soon as it starts to become the reliable money-saving effort of the country that should be funding it, that it starts to be a problem.
That's very good. Thank you for bringing up both sides of that spectrum, because it does really go from both ends of it. So Saeed has a question. Without any formal laws in place, how does the Citizen Science Project make sure that they are working ethically? I think you talked about this with the trust paradigm a little bit, but I don't know if you have any other insights.
Yeah, I think that question is really what has motivated a lot of my work. I was hired into my current job to teach a class in research ethics, and I have doctoral students in health psychology. I have master's students in philosophy, sociology, and we're all within the institution. So we're talking about IRBs and things like that. And it was early on when some work on Facebook and Google and Amazon's Mechanical Turk started to come out. I was like, well, they can look at all these things they can do, and they're not covered by any regulations. Why do we as researchers get stuck? I mean, I'm sorry, that's just a terrible thing for an ethicist to say, right? We're not stuck with ethical research, right? I mean, with ethical guidelines. We're held to a higher standard. And in a lot of ways, that's really good and important. What I'm arguing is they should be held to the same standard if we're going to be trusting their research like we do institutional research. So then I started looking at, especially citizen science, and when you have no money in a lot of projects, how do you do any of this? And I don't have a great answer. I mean, it's like so many areas, we need more money to solve some problems. But I think at least if some of the societies responsible for citizen science make as many tools available for free to address ethical issues, that's a significant benefit. And then there may be a little bit of a carrot and a stick laid on top of that, right? Which is, let's say if you want to join the Citizen Science Association, you take some pledge that you will follow certain sets of guidelines, right? Or you will at least talk with your project about what the ethical guidelines are that you want to follow. So when it comes down to it, I think if you think about the other people in your project as human beings with needs and wants and rights, if you sit down with them, or even if it's too big to sit down with them, to sit down and think about, what do I as a researcher owe to the participants? What do we all together owe to society, right? And what do we as participants owe to the research? That goes sort of both directions. And I think certain sides of the citizen science debate might fail to think about the other side too.
I love the idea of having a community pledge. I think that's a really interesting notion, and something that maybe we can have a discussion about during this conference. So really great. So Shyam has asked, what is your take on the copyrighted issue of photographs being taken for example, in our conference on biodiversity, there's a lot of photographs being used for species discovery. So if somebody wants to buy a photograph, right, of a known species, then how does the individual protect the copyright versus being part of a citizen science project? It's a very, very good question.
That's a great question. Yeah. And we have been thinking about copyright just as one of the sort of many bullet points within one of the tools that we're working on. I think, first of all, the person who donated that is just as entitled to copyright protection as anybody else who takes a picture and puts it somewhere. The difference will be that that person doesn't necessarily have the ability to protect it within the context of a large data set. So let's say you don't, I don't know whether this is actually the case, but let's say you contribute a photo to eBird or something. I think for a lot of these big platforms, you agree ahead of time, we're not going to give you any money. We're not going to try and track you down, right? Because there's a problem there if people don't have accurate emails and things. And so the way for the platform to protect itself is to say, all of this is, when you contribute, it's just going to be open. On the other hand, if you have a smaller project, then I think it's the obligation of the project managers and in conjunction with the maybe platform owners to make it possible for you to have copyright over that photo. And that might mean you sign something that says, I agree to keep my email address updated, right? So that if that's the only way to contact you. In that same citizen science issue that I talked about earlier, there is a paper by Greg Newman and Stacy Lynn, and I think a couple of other authors on the citsci.org platform. And they've given a lot of wonderful thought to ethical issues on their platform. And how does the platform make it possible for the project managers to make it possible for the participants to make individual privacy choices? And so that's a potential advantage of going with a platform, because they've made it possible for you as a leader to make your participants, give your participants as many choices as possible.
That was a very good example with eBird as well, because actually many of the participants actually participate in eBird. Even many of our talks actually involve eBird data sets. So it's really good that you brought that up. And Prabhakar has a question that actually relates to something I want to ask, but I'll ask his question first. So he says, you've mentioned the trust architecture of free and prior informed consent. What situations is this appropriate? And what about traditional knowledge in IPR, which is actually, traditional knowledge is a really, really big issue for us in India, obviously, with having a huge diversity of cultural backgrounds and a lot of traditional knowledge in all of our different regions across the country. So
I'm going to take those as two separate questions. I think the informed consent issue, the letter of it follows establishment research, right? There's this thing you're supposed to do. And we all know that when you sign an informed consent form, somebody shoves a piece of paper in front of you and says, sign this, and you sign it, and then you can have your surgery or participate in the research, right? You've not always had the chance to have a really good conversation about what exactly am I getting into. And so the spirit of informed consent is, I owe you the respect as a human being, as a moral agent who has autonomy over their own life and decisions. And I can't do anything to you unless you agree to it. Well, what does agreement look like? What it requires is that you understand what you're getting into, right? So there are games we can play that I don't describe it very well, and I kind of gloss over some things, right? And we all know that's not really informed consent. So if we look in citizen science at the obligation to treat someone else morally as an autonomous agent, then we don't necessarily need an informed consent form. We're hoping that this reciprocity document that we're putting together does some of that work, but it pairs it with obligations of the researchers to the participants. And so the participant might say, I agree to contribute to this research, but then the researcher says, I agree that I'm going to provide you with a report back at the end, for example. With respect to traditional knowledge and IP, I think, it's a huge issue. There are, I'm having too many thoughts in my head at the same time. There's a phenomenon called ethnographic refusal. And so it's an explicit choice not to put information into the public arena to protect it. And so that might be a choice that traditional knowledge might be a choice they make. I think at the beginning of a project, so this might be where the Comer model is really useful, right? Community owned and managed. So it may be that the community who's in question here says, okay, we're going to do research with you, but we want an explicit contract or memorandum of understanding that says we maintain rights to our traditional knowledge. The unfortunate thing about our world is if you don't protect that in appropriate ways with patents and things like that, then we all think it's okay, legal anyway, to use that knowledge, right? So if you just publish it, then it looks free. So there may be licenses and explicit ownership, even if ownership is anathema to a community. This is the biggest problem, right? We don't own things, we share them, right? Well, if you share them, then other people are going to then own them, right? Whatever you want to do. So I think for a lot of these answers, it's about think about it at the beginning and try and set up the mechanisms. And I know that's not always possible, but to the extent possible, earlier is better.
So regarding actually Prabhakar's first part of his question about the consent and actually I want to ask you, it's also kind of a personal experience of mine and something that you touched upon but didn't really bring up in your talk, which is actually the trust from the academic community. So I've had experiences where when I've been involved in citizen science, I try to make the citizens that I work with authors as much as inherently possible, make them co-owners of the work. It's just the way I work. And I understand not all work it's possible to do that. That in itself has then difficulty once it gets to the scientific community, especially there's actually a lack of sometimes trust in the data. Like, why do you have 150 authors or like 200 or however many you have? And in sometimes journals are like, you can't have this. And so I wanted to ask you about that. How can we better work with the academic community? Because, a lot of citizen scientists, not only provide valuable data just for its own sake, but also provide extremely vital data to academic knowledge. And it needs to be exposed to academic journals, but they themselves have limitations in how you can present the research. So I come up against this multiple times.
Yeah, and it's a great point. And I think I've toggled between these, am I talking to citizen science or am I talking to traditional researchers? And I'm working on a book and I can't even figure out which way I want to go in the book because it's really a different conversation. If you talk to the, establishment researchers, you say, look, you guys need to pay attention to all these things and you need to change your ways to accommodate all of this. But of course, they're in the traditional power position. And so why do they need to change? Then you'd have to sort of beg to change. So I don't mean to suggest at all that it's only citizen science that needs to be doing the work. There's other work to be done. And that is one of them, the authorship issue. The one thing I think I would suggest is if you can keep a little collection of examples where this has already been done, and the more prestigious the journal it's been done in, the better, and say, look, here's, Patients Like Me is a platform for people with different diseases. They published a paper with patients who did self-research. And so if you can go to the author or go to the journal editor and say, there's precedent for all of this, right? That might help a little bit. But I think it is one of the struggles with authorship is its accountability along with the credit. And sometimes for citizen science participants, that's a scary thing. And they might not be in a position actually to be accountable, right? And yet that's these are two sides of a coin in academia. So, we might need to find different ways to acknowledge them.
Yeah, and it very much depends on the type of research you're doing about whether the citizens can be accountable. Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's another question. Sorry, I'm leaning out of the video just so I can read it. Paul has a second question, kind of a follow-up to his previous question about data sets. He says in most of the areas requiring access, the names of the contributors are already given in the data set or can be used by using the website. So how would we attribute it, as kind of goes along with what I was asking about research, how would we attribute it to the contributors without knowing their individual names? So if you anonymously submit data, then you can't acknowledge them, right? And then they maybe don't want to be acknowledged. So most citizen projects or websites don't ask for these questions when joining or submitting data. This goes back to if you want to have them as authors. And then the accountability is a really important issue. That's an issue we struggle with in the academic community anyways, like right. Whether authors are accountable or not without all the citizen science component to it. So
yeah. So again, I think some of this is about infrastructure, that ideally you make these decisions early on and then you give as much choice to individual participants as they can. And so I think our framework on the grant is sort of the best option is give people choices. And the second option is if you can't give them all choices, then you tell them transparently what you're going to do, right? So if I can't give you the choice to opt in or out for being acknowledged, then I might tell you ahead of time, I can't give you credit. And so you just need to know that going into it and click here if you agree or something. Or everyone will be acknowledged in a group name, or everyone will be asked, like what we're going to do for our project is for all the people who helped us build the tools, we're going to go back to them and say, okay, we're ready. Here's the final product. Would you like us to put your name on it or not? And so the people who want to be named will be named, and then we'll have multiple other anonymous for people who don't want to be named. So I think choice and transparency are the top two responses
and
there.
Getting it out at the beginning of the project and not the end. This is a really, I would say probably the most important advice of all is to really think about this now. So, yeah. And this is why we invited you as we're just getting started on this journey of our community and building it. So Lisa, this was fabulous. We're so grateful for you. You gave us so much to think about and so much to ponder over the next few days. And I encourage all of the participants to go to the lounge and ask questions of each other, raise this issue, about the idea of developing a trust architecture, especially where you have commonalities in your work that you're doing. Mm-hmm. I think this is a really great fodder for discussions. Thinking about maybe having a community pledge, we can talk about all of these things. I think there's a lot of fodder we have for the next few days, and it's all thanks to you, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so impressed with all that you guys are doing. And this is just a phenomenal start. I know that India will be a leader in citizen science.
Yes, I think we already have some fabulous projects, and they're already growing very, very rapidly. So with that, we will close the session, and I invite you all tomorrow morning to please join us at 10 a.m. sharp. You're going to meet all the barefoot ecologists, which is a really, really fun session with lots and lots of different participants. So that will be a lot of fun tomorrow, and a lot of citizen scientists who are leading that project as well. So I'll see you at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everybody.